Now, this conversation about humanity starts with a 30-year-old memory of a visit to a genocide museum in Cambodia. Tol Sling had originally been a high school, but it became a place of torture and a place of death for something like 20,000 people during the Pol Pot's regime. When you go to the museum now, you walk through classroom after classroom with walls covered with photos of people who were photographed when they were arrested. One photo sticks with me, a young woman, sad, staring at the camera. But in the corner of the photo was a small child, no doubt arrested and perished with her mother. Somehow, this woman and her child were a threat to that regime. 30 years on, I've seen too many other ruthless regimes, including governments, militants, and armies. They want to eliminate their enemies because of religion, race, or their presence on disputed land. For these regimes, invariably, civilians and especially children are a threat to their superiority. However, Tol Sling prison does not define Cambodia. You've probably been there yourself. You would have seen rebirth. You would have seen amazing culture in places like Angkor Wat, and you would have met Cambodians who exude energy. And I often think hard about that tension. Oppression and suffering on one side, and yet resilience in the midst of the worst circumstances. Now, Cambodia is an important point of reference for two reasons, one of which we'll come back to later on. But first of all, because it was colonised. Back in Europe, some governments got together, drew some lines on maps, and gave that country to France, regardless of who was already there. As our acknowledgement of country, perhaps we should agree that stealing land, parcelling it out, and giving it to somebody else, regardless of who's there, is wrong. It's wrong in Australia, wrong in Asia, wrong in Africa, and wrong in Palestine. Today, we're on Jarrah country, land that was forcefully occupied by white settlers. I'd like to acknowledge the resilience of the Dja Dja Wurrung elders and ancestors and all of the First Nations people who work for human rights. In this conversation, let's agree to reject racism, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and instead let's affirm the humanity of everyone. Racism and prejudice seep through in our upbringing, comes through in media and religious teachings about superiority. Uncomfortable conversations actually require us to dig deep, to examine those messages, and to instead hold on to justice and the same human rights that apply for everyone, not just ourselves and our friends. And of course, my topic is a political and historical minefield. Everything is contested, especially words. I've chosen mine carefully based on what I've seen and what people in Gaza, Westbank and Israel have told me. Which leads us to Gaza. I was last there in 2018. A hospital in Gaza City asked me to come and run some strength-based community workshops. I pondered, what strengths did a white, privileged Australian male offer to Palestinian women living under occupation? Despite my apprehensions, the workshops went well, and I was deeply touched by their humour and their hospitality. They were complementary with that Arabic graciousness that I saw everywhere. It mattered to them that someone had come to be with them. It mattered that people here cared about their situation. And it matters still that we bear witness. But why talk about 2018? Didn't all the trouble start in October 2023? Uncomfortable conversations mean asking about context, history, and all of the things that came before that awful attack on October the 7th. Even in 2018, Gazans experienced daily terrors because they lived on disputed land, because they were Palestinians. During my visit, armed drones were constantly overhead, Lots of bombs were dropped. And a 5-story community centre, not a military installation, a community centre, just half a kilometre from where I was staying, was totally flattened by Israeli F-16 jets. A previous trip in 2014 was just after another massive Israeli incursion. Then I drove through suburbs of totally destroyed buildings, including hospitals and disability centres. People were living in rubble, and when we stopped to look around, they offered us tea, Palestinian hospitality. I learned from the hospital director that Israel does not allow radiotherapy in Gaza. So if you're a woman with breast cancer, you have to travel out. However, 50% of women seeking radiotherapy are prohibited from entering into Israel. Like that woman in Tol Slang, that mother, they're a security threat. I don't know how many of my workshop participants are still alive at the moment. I know some have died, including Mahmoud, murdered on his own balcony by IDF snipers, of all things on Good Friday. The hospital has had to close, its walls torn down by tanks, drones sent through its corridors, and all of the staff, just about all of the staff, arrested. Another friend who hosted a fabulous feast for me with his family now lives in a tent with that family. He sent me a picture of his apartment, now a blackened cave thanks to IDF. My super smart interpreter from that workshop now also lives in a tent with her husband and 2 small boys. She and her sons are terrified, yet even so she's looking after the people around her. Now, for 3 decades, my work has involved supporting humanitarian responses around the globe. These interventions require people to be kept alive, civilians protected, and make sure that their rights are upheld. Resources need to be mobilised. Harms and threats must be reduced. Most times, the global community works together and they work on principles of international law. Yet over the last 10 months, actually 302 days today, Gaza has seen carpet bombings, closure of hospitals, forced relocations, mass starvation, and genocidal acts as defined by the UN. The Lancet, one of the world's oldest peer-reviewed medical journals, estimates that something like 200,000 people have perished in this time. These actions are disproportionate and may constitute a war crime. They continue a 75-year process that takes us further and further away from peace. So what's different here? Where is the global humanitarian response to protect lives in Gaza? Perhaps this is at the heart of this uncomfortable conversation. I believe that if these things had happened anywhere else, there would have been from our government widespread sanctions, ending of trade, and possibly military intervention. We sanction Russia for invading Ukraine. Do you know we intervene militarily to protect trade routes, but we don't seem to respond to protect human lives in Gaza. Now, again, this talk is about the importance of international humanitarian law and human rights. These ideals were forged out of the horrors of World War II, and if we don't hold on to them, we're truly lost. If government actions anywhere are judged illegal, when genocide is justified or identified, when war crimes are noted, we can't shrug our shoulders or say they brought it on themselves. To do so makes us complicit. Now back to Cambodia and the Genocide Museum. It's relevant. That memorial exists because Cambodia found a just and fair peace for itself. It could choose freedom. Will Gaza get that same choice? In the future, will there be memorials to Israeli and Palestinian lives as markers of a new, just peace for everyone? Or in 20 years' time, will there still be those same patterns of oppression and pointless recriminations? There are examples of big change. ending of apartheid in South Africa, independence for Timor-Leste. Long struggles and mass action lead to breakthroughs. I dare to believe in the possibility of liberation for Palestine. Now, if we want that liberation, it will take many conversations and a sustained commitment to human rights. It'll also take a collective action. Challenge yourself to do one thing. I could suggest 20, but I'm running out of time. Make your own commitment to human rights. In the case of Gaza, look up organisations like APAN, the Australian Palestinian Advocacy Network, APAN. Read their stuff and get involved in their actions. Finally, let's refuse together to give in to futility or to stay silent. The Australian government has actually made tiny steps to improve its stance on Israel and Gaza, thanks to APAN and others. But much more needs to happen. So come join a movement for human rights and justice for all humanity. My friends in Gaza will thank you, as will people elsewhere.